The morning she would remember forever started the same way every other morning started. Camille Torres was on her knees, not praying, scrubbing. The white marble floor of the Hale foyer stretched out in every direction, cold and gleaming and completely indifferent to the woman polishing it on all fours at 6:45 in the morning. The house smelled like lemon cleaning solution and fresh coffee. Outside, San Diego was still gray and quiet. And inside, Camille worked in silence, the way she always did, moving the mop in long, careful strokes, rinsing, repeating, watching the floor come back to life under her hands. She heard him before she saw him, the precise click of dress shoes on the staircase, the muffled thud of a leather briefcase against the banister. Marcus Hale descended into his own foyer the way powerful men always do, without looking down. His eyes were already somewhere else. His phone was already in his hand. He stepped directly over Camille's bucket, pivoted toward the kitchen, and was gone without a word. Not a good morning, not a nod, not a glance. Just the sharp scent of expensive cologne disappearing around the corner. Camille sat back on her heels and let out a breath that barely made a sound. 2 years. She had worked in this house for 2 years, and Marcus Hale still moved through her presence the way people move through air. Not rudely, not cruelly, just completely. As if she were part of the architecture, a necessary fixture, like the chandelier above her or the marble beneath her. Useful, invisible, easy to overlook. She gathered her bucket and stood, rolling her shoulders back, and walked toward the sound that actually mattered to her in this house, the padding of small bare feet on the upstairs hallway. Then a door swinging open, then a voice, high and clear as a bell. "Cammy, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." Sophie Hale appeared at the top of the stairs in her school uniform, one sock on and one sock missing, her dark hair sticking up on one side, in a way that suggested she had slept on it wet. She was 7 years old, and she was, as far as Camille was concerned, one of the finest human beings currently walking the earth. Sophie spotted Camille, and her whole face changed, the way a child's face changes when they see the person they actually feel safe with. "My sock," Sophie announced, descending the stairs with the gravity of a small politician. "It went under the bed, and I can't reach it." "Did you try the broom handle?" Camille asked. Sophie blinked. "That's smart," she said, as if she hadn't heard this exact suggestion at least 4 times before. Camille smiled and moved up the stairs, and when she passed the hallway bathroom, she paused, the way she always paused at this hour, to listen. The door was slightly open. Inside, Theo was washing his face. She could hear the water running. She could hear him humming to himself, the tuneless little hum he made when he was in a good mood. And she stood there for just a moment, not eavesdropping, not watching, just listening for the rhythm of him, the steadiness of it, making sure everything sounded right. Because with Theo, you had to listen. You always had to listen. He was 5 years old, and he was built like his father. Slight frame, serious eyes, a quiet that went deeper than most children's quiet. He had his mother's coloring, warm brown skin, and long lashes that sat against his cheeks when he slept. And he had something else, something nobody in this house knew about except Camille. Something she had noticed 6 months into working here and had never stopped watching since. The water in the bathroom shut off. Theo appeared in the doorway, face damp, pajamas still on. "You're not dressed," Camille told him gently. "I know," he said. He looked up at her with those serious eyes, and then, because he was 5 and could not help it, his face broke into a full, gap-toothed smile. "Morning, Cammy." "Morning, baby," she said, and she walked him to his room to find his uniform. This was the shape of her days. This was what 2 years looked like, laid flat and examined. Marcus Hale paid her to clean his house, to mop his floors and scrub his bathrooms, and keep the kitchen gleaming, and the laundry folded, and the household running on a quiet, invisible track that he never had to think about. That was the job description. That was what the agency had told her when they placed her here. That was what it said on the contract she had signed, sitting across from a stone-faced HR manager in a building full of glass and ambient light. But the contract had not mentioned Sophie's nightmares. It had not mentioned Theo's lunches, so carefully packed because he wouldn't eat anything with green in it, but would eat spinach if she hid it in the eggs. It had not mentioned the school projects done at the kitchen table, or the bedtime stories, or the mornings she sat on the edge of Theo's bed and counted his breathing while he slept. The contract said nothing about any of that. It said nothing about love either. But here it was anyway. Marcus Hale was not a bad man. Camille had decided this early, and she had not changed her mind in 2 years. He was a grieving man, which was different. His wife, Elena, had died 22 months ago, a sudden aneurysm on a Sunday afternoon. No warning, no goodbye. She was there, and then she wasn't. And what Marcus had done in the aftermath, the way most people respond to that kind of loss, was work. He had buried himself in his company, on it in his deals, in his spreadsheets, and his conference calls, and his 6-figure dinners. He had built a wall of productivity around his grief so thick that even his own children couldn't quite reach him through it. He wasn't cruel to Sophie and Theo. He kissed them goodnight when he was home before their bedtime, which wasn't often. He attended the important things, the school play, the pediatrician visits, the birthday parties with the bouncy castles, and the store-bought cakes. He provided. He protected. He showed up, technically. He just wasn't present. Not in the way they needed. Not in the way Elena had been present, apparently, because Sophie still talked about her mother with a reverential hush, the way people talk about somewhere they loved that they can never go back to. Into that absence, Camille had stepped, quietly, without announcement, not because she was hired to, but because the children were right in front of her, and they needed someone and she was there. She had made a choice in the first week that she would probably never fully explain to anyone. She was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway when she heard Theo crying in his room. Not loudly, not dramatically, just that thin, tired crying that children do when they've been sad for so long it doesn't even feel like sadness anymore. She went in. She sat on the floor next to his bed. She didn't say anything clever or therapeutic. She just sat there until he stopped, and then she tucked him in and turned his nightlight on and went back to folding laundry. That was all. That was where it started. The house on Magnolia Drive was beautiful in the way that houses built for status are beautiful. High ceilings, wide windows, imported stone. A garden designed by someone who was paid a great deal to make it look effortless. It sat at the end of a quiet street in a neighborhood where driveways were long and neighbors were polite and invisible. Marcus had bought it when Sophie was born, when Elena was still alive, when this was going to be one kind of life. Now, it was another kind. The rooms were the same. The people inside them were different. Diane Whitfield arrived at the house on a Wednesday, the way she usually did, in a white BMW that she parked at an angle in the driveway, as if she were a guest and not a woman who had been inserting herself into the household for the better part of a year. When she was Elena's college friend, that was the story, the official story, the one that came with photographs and shared memories, and a grief that had apparently, over time, transformed into something more convenient. She was elegant, somewhere in her late 30s, with the particular confidence that comes from having always occupied the center of every room. Camille was in the kitchen when Diane came through the front door, without knocking. She never knocked, and walked directly past without making eye contact. Not hostile, exactly. Just absent. The way Marcus walked past, the way most of them did. "Is Marcus home?" Diane asked, addressing the question to the middle distance. "He left early," Camille said. "Around 7. Diane made a small noise that could have meant anything and set her bag on the kitchen island. She poured herself coffee from the pot Camille had made, stood at the counter looking out at the garden, and then, this was the part Camille had learned to brace for, turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. The kind of look that catalogs and dismisses at the same time. "Have the children had breakfast?" "An hour ago," Camille said. "They're getting their bags." "You should make sure Sophie's folder is in her bag. She left it behind last week." "Already in there," Camille said. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands moving, rinsing the breakfast bowls, setting them in the rack. Diane tilted her head slightly, the way you might look at a machine that is performing better than expected. "Good," she said. And that was all. She turned back to the garden. That was the texture of it, not a dramatic cruelty, not the kind of thing you could point to clearly and say, "There, look at that." It was smaller than that and, therefore, harder to name. It was in the way Diane said the children's names to their faces and referred to them, in conversations with Marcus, as the kids, and referred to Camille, in conversations with anyone, as your girl or the help or, most often, just the maid. It was in the way she rearranged things in the kitchen on the assumption that Camille had put them wrong. It was in the way she interrupted. It was in the particular smile she gave when Marcus said something kind to Camille in passing. A quick, watchful smile that lasted exactly 1 second. A smile that said, "I am noting this." Camille had spent 2 years being noted. She had gotten very good at giving nothing back to note. What she had not gotten good at was the fear. The specific, contained fear she carried for Theo, which lived in her chest like a stone that never fully warmed. She had noticed it first 8 months ago. She was bathing him after a long day, when he had been running around the yard, chasing Sophie with a foam sword. He had stopped suddenly, sat down on the grass, and pressed one small hand flat against his chest. He hadn't cried. He didn't complain. He just sat there for a moment with his hand over his heart, breathing slowly, and then he was up and running again as if nothing had happened. Anyone else might have missed it. Camille had not missed it. Because Camille Torres had spent 6 years as a pediatric nurse before the life she had planned came apart at the seams, and the part of her brain that had been trained in those years did not turn off just because she was now holding a mop instead of a chart. She knew what she'd seen. She had watched Theo for the next 3 weeks with the calibrated attention of someone who is afraid of being right. She was right. It didn't happen often. But it happened. The slight pause, the hand to the chest. Once, on a morning when he'd run up the stairs, a barely perceptible change in his color, a grayness around his mouth that lasted less than 30 seconds and then resolved. She had knelt in front of him and asked him quietly if his heart ever felt funny, and he had looked at her with those serious eyes and said yes, sometimes, like it's fluttering, like a bird. And then he had asked her what was for lunch. She had made an appointment for him that same week. No, not with his regular pediatrician. That would have required Marcus's involvement. Explanations she was not sure how to give. Questions she was not sure how to answer. She made an appointment with a pediatric cardiologist at a clinic across town, paid for out of her own pocket, and took Theo on what she told him was a special doctor visit just for him. He was 4 at the time. He wore his best sweater. He sat on the examination table with enormous dignity and answered every question the doctor asked him with perfect solemnity. The preliminary findings had been careful, measured. A possible arrhythmia. Likely benign, the doctor said. But worth watching. Worth monitoring. Bring him back in 3 months. She had brought him back in 3 months. And 3 months after that. She kept a small notebook in the bottom of her cleaning supply bag, folded inside a Ziploc pouch to protect it from the bleach and the water. In it, she recorded dates, observations, the duration of episodes, any changes in his color or energy, what he had eaten, how much he had slept. She had 4 pages of notes on Theo Hale that his father did not know existed, that no one in this house knew existed. She had told herself many times that she would tell Marcus, that she would find the right moment, the right words, the right way to say, I noticed something about your son that I am not technically qualified to notice anymore. But I am telling you anyway, because I love him, and I am afraid. She had drafted the conversation in her head during long mopping sessions, lying awake at night, driving the children to school. She had never given it, because every time she reached for the right moment, Diane was there, or Marcus was already halfway out the door, or the atmosphere in the house was wrong, brittle and distracted, and the words dissolved before she could find them. And because this was the part that shamed her, the part she turned away from when she examined it too closely. She was afraid of losing this job, of losing them, of the conversation ending with her being thanked for her concern and sent home, and Theo being left with someone who didn't know to listen. It was selfish, and it was selfless at the same time, and she had learned to carry the contradiction the way she carried everything else, quietly, without complaint, in the bottom of a cleaning bag. The morning Theo collapsed at school started the same way every morning started. So she had packed his lunch, turkey and cheese, no green, apple slices with a small pot of peanut butter for dipping, a note folded in the corner that said 3 sons in a row, their private shorthand for a good day. She had double-checked his bag. She had walked both children to the car and driven them to school herself, because Marcus had a 6:30 call, and Diane did not do school drop-offs. She had watched them walk through the gate, Sophie bounding ahead, Theo walking with his characteristic careful pace. He had turned at the entrance and given her the small wave he always gave, 2 fingers raised, solemn as a salute. She had waved back. She had been mopping the downstairs hallway when her phone rang. It was 11:14 in the morning. She looked at the screen. Jefferson Elementary School. She answered before the second ring. Ms. Torres, the voice said, and she knew from the particular steadiness of it, the over-controlled calm of someone trying to say something frightening without frightening anyone further. This is the school nurse. We need you to come in. It's Theo. Camille was already reaching for her keys. What happened? She said. Not a question. A command for information. He fainted during recess. He's conscious now. He's awake and he's calm. But the paramedics are here, and they want to take him to St. Catherine's. We've been trying to reach his father. I'm on my way, Camille said. Don't let him be scared. Tell him Cammie's coming. He'll understand. She was out the door before the call ended. She did not stop to put on her shoes properly. She did not leave a note. She drove the 11 minutes to Jefferson Elementary with a focus so absolute it left no room for the fear, which would have to wait, which would have to stay in the back seat until Theo was in front of her, and she could look at his face and take his pulse with 2 fingers at his wrist, and know, with the part of her that never stopped being a nurse, whether or not it was what she feared. What she didn't know, and could not have predicted, was that Marcus Hale, sitting in a glass conference room on the 38th floor, phone face down on the table because his rule during client meetings was absolute silence, would check his screen at 11:27 and find 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, a missed call from the school, and a text from his assistant that said, "Sir, your son's school is trying to reach you. Now something has happened." What she did not know was that Marcus would stand up in the middle of that meeting, in front of clients, in front of partners, in front of people whose time cost more per hour than most people earned in a week, and walk out without a word. What she did not know was that when Marcus Hale arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital at 12:03 and demanded to know where his son was, the woman at the admissions desk would look at her screen and say, "Are you a family member, sir?" And he would say, "I'm his father." And she would say, "I see, a Ms. Camille Torres is listed as his emergency contact. She's already with him, room 7. And the look on Marcus Hale's face in that moment was something the admissions nurse would remember for a long time. Not anger, not offense. Something slower than that, and something that moved through him like a current and left a different expression in its wake. He walked down the corridor to room 7. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. And there was Camille Torres, the woman who mopped his floors, who he had stepped over without looking down that very morning, sitting on the edge of his son's hospital bed, holding Theo's hand in both of hers, her head bent toward his, speaking too quietly for Marcus to hear. Theo's small face was turned toward her. His eyes were open and calm. He was wearing a paper hospital bracelet on his thin wrist and a small pulse monitor on his finger, and he was talking to her with the relaxed ease of a child who is frightened, but knows, absolutely knows, that the person beside him will not let anything bad happen. Marcus stood in the doorway and did not speak, and he was not sure he could, because what he was seeing did not match the category he had placed this woman in. The category that said staff, help, the maid, background, and the distance between that category and this room, this woman, this child, this hand held with that particular quality of tenderness that cannot be performed. That distance was enormous. He was only beginning, in this moment, to understand how enormous it was. Theo looked up and saw him. "Daddy," he said. His voice was small and steady. Marcus crossed the room. He knelt beside the bed. He took his son's other hand, and over Theo's head, his eyes found Camille's for the first time all morning. For the first time, really, in a very long time. She looked back at him without flinching. She did not apologize for being here. She did not defer. She just looked at him with the level, exhausted gaze of someone who has been doing something important for a long time without being seen, and who is no longer entirely sure it matters whether they are seen or not. "He's okay," she said quietly. "His color is good. They've run an EKG. The doctor will be in soon." A pause. "I can explain everything." Marcus heard the weight in those last 3 words. Everything. Not just today. Not just this room. Everything. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, and then at his son, and then back at her again. And the question that was forming behind his eyes, the one that asked how, and how long, and why didn't I know? That question was going to need an answer. They both understood that. But for now, Theo's hand was warm in his. The monitor beeped steady and slow. And Camille Torres, who mopped his floors and packed his son's lunches and carried a notebook full of observations nobody asked her to make, sat on the edge of that bed and breathed. She had been running toward this room for 2 years. She just hadn't known it until now. The doctor's name was Dr. Anita Reyes, and she came into room 7 with the particular brisk warmth of someone who has delivered difficult news often enough to know how to carry it without dropping it. She was young, younger than Marcus expected, with a tablet under one arm and eyes that moved quickly between the 2 adults in the room before settling on Marcus with a polite, professional assessment. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm glad you're here." Marcus stood. He had been sitting in the chair beside Theo's bed for the past 20 minutes, not holding his son's hand, while Theo dozed in the light, medicated sleep of a child whose body had been through something exhausting. Camille had moved to the window when Marcus arrived, giving them space without leaving, standing quietly with her arms folded across her chest, watching the parking lot below with the still, patient presence of someone who had learned how to be in a room without taking up too much of it. "Tell me what's happening," Marcus said. Dr. Reyes looked at her tablet. Theo presented with a syncopal episode at school, a brief loss of consciousness during physical activity. His vitals on arrival were stable, and he recovered quickly, which is encouraging. She looked up. His EKG shows an irregular pattern consistent with a supraventricular arrhythmia. In simple terms, his heart occasionally beats out of its normal rhythm. It's not immediately life-threatening, but it needs to be managed, monitored. He'll need a cardiac specialist and likely a longer-term care plan. Marcus absorbed this the way he absorbed bad news in boardrooms. Very still, jaw set, eyes steady. "How long has this been going on?" Dr. Reyes paused. A small pause, but Camille felt it like a hand on her shoulder. The doctor looked at her tablet again. "According to the records we have from his previous cardiac consultations." She stopped, looked up. "Mr. Hale, are you aware that Theo has been seen at the pediatric cardiology clinic on Harbor Drive? 3 times in the past." She checked. 14 months. The room went very quiet. Marcus turned slowly toward the window. Camille did not move. She stood with her arms still folded, at her shoulders absolutely level, her eyes on the parking lot. She could feel his gaze on the side of her face, the way you feel sunlight coming through glass, warm and pressing and impossible to ignore. "No," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, carefully quiet. "I wasn't aware." Dr. Reyes cleared her throat gently. "The consent forms on those visits were signed by she read from the screen, Camille Torres, listed as his caregiver." She looked between them once more and, with the practiced discretion of someone who understood that she had just walked into the middle of something, said simply, "I'll give you both a few minutes. A cardiologist from our team will be in within the hour." She set a printed summary on the bedside table and left, pulling the door softly behind her. The silence that followed lasted long enough to have weight. Theo slept on, his chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. The monitor beeped its steady, indifferent count. Outside the window, a cloud shifted, and a thin bar of afternoon light moved across the floor, between Camille and Marcus, like a line drawn by someone else's hand. "How long?" Marcus said it without turning. Not a question. A reckoning. Camille unfolded her arms. She turned from the window to face him. 14 months, she said. Since he was 4. Marcus finally looked at her. His face was difficult to read. Not blank, but layered. The way a face looks when too many emotions arrive at once, and none of them have been shown the door yet. "You took my son to a cardiologist without telling me." "Yes." "You signed consent forms." "Yes." "You paid for it." He said it flatly, but she heard the undercurrent, the particular discomfort of a man who has just learned that someone he considered beneath his notice was doing something he should have been doing himself. "The first 3 visits, yes. The clinic has a sliding scale." She kept her voice steady. Not defensive, not apologetic. Steady, the way she'd been steady in conference rooms that were someone else's territory, and hospital rooms, like this one, and 100 other situations, where she was the smallest person in the room and needed to be heard anyway. After the 3rd visit, they offered a monitoring program. I enrolled him. Marcus sat down. He sat down the way people sit when their legs stop cooperating, not collapsing, but surrendering incrementally, the way something solid gives way under sustained pressure. He put both elbows on his knees. He looked at his sleeping son for a long time. "You should have told me," he said finally. "I know. That's my child. I know that too." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it did not waver. "I tried to find the right moment. More than once. And then I told myself I was protecting him, and I think that was partially true. But I was also protecting myself." She let that sit for a second. "I was afraid you would send me away, and then there would be nobody watching him." Marcus looked up at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that wasn't anger and wasn't forgiveness yet, but was sitting somewhere in between, trying to find its footing. "Nobody watching him," he repeated slowly. "You mean I wasn't watching him?" Camille said nothing. She didn't have to. Marcus ran a hand over his face and sat back. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was genuinely uncertain. Not the controlled, efficient uncertainty of a CEO recalculating a strategy. The raw, personal uncertainty of a father who has just been handed evidence that the distance he maintained from his own life was not as harmless as he had told himself it was. "Tell me," he said. "From the beginning. All of it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." So she told him. She stood by the window of that hospital room with her son, with his son, asleep between them, and she told him everything. She told him about the afternoon in the backyard with the foam sword, the hand pressed to the chest, and the 30 seconds of gray pallor that anyone else might have walked past. She told him about the notebook, and at this, she reached into her bag and set it on the edge of the bedside table, the small, battered notebook with the Ziploc cover, its pages soft from handling. She told him about the clinic on Harbor Drive and the doctor who had been kind and careful and who had said the word arrhythmia in the same even tone that Dr. Reyes had used today, as if the word were a map and not a verdict. She told him about the enrollment in the monitoring program, the quarterly check-ins, the specific triggers to watch for, heat, exertion, dehydration, and the way she had adjusted Theo's routines quietly, invisibly, making sure he drank water before recess, making sure he rested after PE, so making sure his lunches had the right composition for a child whose heart occasionally forgot its own tempo. She told him about the note she wrote and rewrote 6 times and never delivered, the version she had gotten as far as sliding under his study door before pulling it back at the last second because she heard Diane's car in the driveway and the moment collapsed. And then she stopped, because she had arrived at the part that was hardest to say, the part that was not about Theo. Marcus had been listening without moving, his elbows back on his knees, his eyes on the floor. Now he looked up. "There's more," he said. Camille picked up the notebook from the bedside table. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she held it out to him. He took it. He opened it. He read the first page, the date, the observation, the careful clinical notation in her small handwriting. And then he looked up at her, with the question forming on his face, before he had the words for it. "I was a pediatric nurse," she said, "for 6 years, at St. Joseph's before it." She stopped. "Before a lot of things." Marcus closed the notebook slowly. He held it in both hands like something breakable. "You never said. You never asked." The words were not an accusation. They were simply true, and they both knew it. "I was your cleaner, Mr. Hale. People don't ask their cleaners what they used to be." He had no answer for that. She watched him sit with it, the weight of it, the specific shame of it, and she did not fill the silence to make it easier for him. Because it shouldn't be easy. Because some silences deserve to be sat in fully, without rescue, until the person inside them understands what they're being shown. "Why did you leave nursing?" he asked at last. It was a longer answer, and she gave him the short version, because Theo was asleep a foot away, and this was not the place for her own full history. She told him that her mother had been ill, that she had taken a leave to care for her, and that, in the year she was away, her certification lapsed, and the process to reinstate it had been slow and expensive, and she had needed income in the meantime, that she had found the agency, found the placement, found this house. She told him she had intended to recertify within a year. That was 2 years ago. And the reason it was 2 years ago, the reason she had not yet left, had not pushed harder toward recertification, and had stayed in a job that paid a fraction of what she was worth and asked her to be invisible, was asleep right there in that hospital bed with a monitor on his finger and a paper bracelet on his wrist. Marcus looked at his son. He looked at the notebook in his hands. He set it carefully on the bedside table. "Sophie calls you Cammy," he said. It seemed like an odd thing to say in this moment, and maybe he knew it, because something shifted in his face as he said it. Something private and self-directed, an acknowledgement of something he had been choosing not to look at for a long time. "Yes," Camille said. "Theo does too." "Yes." He nodded, very slowly. The way people nod when they are not agreeing to anything in particular, but are trying to process the specific distance between what they believed and what is true. Then he said, one with a quietness that cost him something, He's never fainted before. No, she said. He's had episodes, but nothing like this. The heat today, and running. It was the right conditions for it to escalate. I should have... She paused. I should have told you before it got to here. That was my mistake. Not the rest of it, but the telling. That was mine. Marcus stood up again. He walked to the window and stood where she had been standing, looking out at the parking lot. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he carried things in his spine, the way people who are used to being strong always carry them, in the part of the body that is hardest to reach. I called you the Maid, he said. At the Anderson dinner, in January, his voice was careful. Diane was asking about the household, and I said, I remember saying. He stopped. He turned around. I said just the Maid. Camille met his eyes. She remembered January. She had been in the kitchen doorway when he said it, not close enough to be part of the conversation, not far enough to pretend she hadn't heard. She had carried those 3 words home to her small room at the end of the hall and set them down quietly and gone on with the next morning, the way she always went on. Yes, she said. I'm sorry, he said. Plainly. No preamble, no qualifier, no language designed to soften the accountability. Just, I'm sorry. And she could see it cost him something, not because powerful men found those words hard, necessarily, but because this particular man was looking at the distance between what he'd said and what was true. And the distance was enormous, and he was beginning to understand that he had been measuring the wrong things for a very long time. Before she could respond, the door to room 7 swung open. Diane Whitfield filled the doorway the way she always filled doorways, with the full expectation of the room reorganizing itself around her arrival. She was in her cream coat, her bag over one shoulder, her hair perfect in the way that suggested she had taken the time to be perfect, even in an emergency, which was its own kind of statement. Her eyes moved to Theo first, a quick, assessing sweep, and then to Marcus, and then, last, the way you look at something minor and peripheral to Camille. Oh, good, Diane said, coming into the room. You're both here. She touched Marcus's arm. How is he? I came as soon as I got your message. The traffic was awful. She leaned over the bed, brushed Theo's hair back from his face, in a gesture that was technically tender and somehow completely hollow. Poor little thing. He's stable, Marcus said. The doctor will be back soon. Good. Good. Diane straightened. She looked around the room with the particular survey of a person taking inventory. Her eyes landed on the notebook on the bedside table, then on Camille, then back on Marcus. Her voice, when it came, was friendly and impeccably calibrated. I'm glad you were at the school for drop-off this morning, Camille. Awful situation. A pause. Though I suppose this is exactly the kind of situation where you really need family present, isn't it? Not, another pause, shorter, precisely placed, staff. The word hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus heard it. Camille watched his face and saw him hear it, saw the slight tightening around his jaw, the flicker of something that was not yet fully named, but was moving in the direction of clarity. Diane had meant it to land softly, disguised as a reasonable observation. It had not landed softly. It had landed the way those particular words always landed, like a boundary being drawn, like a door being held mostly shut. Camille said nothing. She was practiced at saying nothing when Diane drew those lines. She had 2 years of practice. But Marcus said, she knew about his heart condition. Diane turned to look at him. I'm sorry? Theo has an arrhythmia. He's been seeing a cardiologist for over a year. Marcus's voice was even, informational, like he was reading from a document. Camille noticed it. She arranged the appointments. She's been monitoring him. He picked up the notebook from the bedside table and held it up briefly, then set it back down. I didn't know. You didn't know. Camille knew. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one before. That one had been heavy with private reckoning. This one was charged. The particular charge of a room where someone has just had the architecture of their position quietly rearranged without being warned. Diane's smile did not disappear. It thinned. Well, she said, and there was something beneath the word that Camille recognized. Not panic. Not yet. But its precursor. The particular alertness of a person who understands that the story they have been carefully managing has just introduced a new variable. Oh, that's certainly above and beyond. She looked at Camille with the smile still thin and said, I'm sure it came from a good place. It came from knowing what I was looking at, Camille said. Quietly, without heat. Diane turned back to Marcus. Of course we're grateful. I'm not grateful, Marcus said. He said it without raising his voice, without drama. He said it the way you say something that has just become, obviously, undeniably true. Grateful isn't the right word. Grateful is what you are when someone does you a favor. He looked at Camille. She was doing what nobody else in this house was doing. That's not a favor. That's something else entirely. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Marcus, can you give us a few minutes, Diane? It was not phrased as a question. Diane heard it, and the smile thinned further, on straining against something underneath it that wanted badly to surface. She looked at Camille once more, and in that look was everything that had been building in this house for a year. The quiet territorial pressure, the small daily erasures, the very deliberate campaign to keep Camille firmly in the category of staff, of help, of just the maid. And then she looked back at Marcus, and she read something in his face that she clearly did not like reading. Of course, she said, with perfect courtesy. She gathered her bag. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a small, controlled click. In the quiet that followed, Marcus looked at Theo. Theo was beginning to stir, the light sleep of exhaustion lifting, his small face moving toward wakefulness. His eyelashes fluttered. His hand shifted on the blanket. Kami, Theo murmured, not fully awake. His eyes weren't open yet. Just the word, dropped into the room like something automatic, like something so deeply rooted it surfaced even from sleep. Camille crossed to the bed. She sat on the edge of it, the same way she'd been sitting when Marcus arrived. She put her hand over Theo's, and his fingers curled around hers without him opening his eyes. Marcus watched this. He stood at the window where she had stood, and he watched the way his son reached for her in the dark of half-sleep, and he understood, in the specific, irreversible way that understanding sometimes comes, not gradually but all at once, like a wall giving way, that this was what he had missed. Not the arrhythmia, not the notebook, not the medical appointments he should have been taking his son to. This, the hand, the automatic reaching, the trust built in the hours he hadn't been there. In the mornings, he had stepped over a bucket without looking down. In the 2 years he had walked through this woman's presence like she was air. He had called her just the maid in January, and the whole building had not shaken. The floor had not opened. He had poured himself coffee and continued his dinner, But here was the accounting. Here was the actual record. And it was not in a spreadsheet or a profit report or any of the documents he was so practiced at reading. It was in a small hand curved around a larger one, in the sound of a child's voice reaching for safety, in a worn notebook full of careful observations that nobody had asked this woman to make and that she had made anyway for 14 months, out of nothing but love and the particular courage of someone who has chosen, quietly and without recognition, to be responsible for a life. Marcus Hale stood at the window of room 7 and felt the full weight of the last 2 years rearrange themselves into their actual meaning. It was, he would think later, the most important moment of clarity he had ever had. And it had not come from a board meeting. It had not come from a profit report. It had come from a hospital room and a sleeping child, and the small, specific mercy of a woman who mopped his floors and had never once stopped paying attention to the things that actually mattered. Outside in the corridor, he could hear Diane's heels moving away down the linoleum, measured, retreating. And something about that sound, its precision, its control, its absolute refusal to be anything other than composed, made the distance between that and the warm, an unguarded hand-holding happening 3 feet away, feel like the distance between 2 entirely different kinds of life. He did not know, yet, what he was going to do. He did not have the language for it. But he knew, with the certainty of something finally seen clearly, that nothing in that house could go on exactly as it had been. The cardiologist arrived at 2:45. Dr. Samuel Park was thorough, careful, and precise. He spoke to both Marcus and Camille, not to one more than the other, picking up without apparent surprise that this woman in the plain clothes, who asked quiet, medically specific questions, was as much a part of this child's care history as the father in the expensive suit. He reviewed the notebook with what appeared to be genuine respect, asked Camille 2 follow-up questions that she answered without hesitation. Diane outlined a care plan for Theo that was manageable and, with proper monitoring, entirely livable. Supraventricular arrhythmia in children is very often something they grow through, he told them. With the right management, there is no reason Theo can't live a completely full life. He looked at Camille directly. The fact that this was caught early, and that someone was paying close attention, that matters. That's why we're here at this stage, and not further along. Marcus looked at Camille. Camille looked at her hands. Theo, now fully awake and sitting up against his pillows with the energy of a child who had decided the medical drama was over, said, "Can I have a juice box?" And something broke open in the room then. Not tragedy, not drama, but the particular relief that comes after sustained fear from the unwinding of something that has been tightly held for a very long time. Camille laughed before she could stop herself, a short, real, exhausted laugh, and covered her mouth with one hand, and Theo looked at her with enormous satisfaction at having caused it. "I'll find you a juice box," she said. "Apple," he specified. "Obviously," she said. She stood and moved toward the door, and Marcus said her name, Camille, and she stopped. Turned. He was looking at her with that same layered expression, but something had shifted in it now, loosened slightly, the way a fist unclenches after a long hold. "We need to talk," he said. "Not tonight. When he's settled. But we need to talk about all of it." She looked at him for a moment. She read the sincerity in it, and the discomfort of a man who was not yet sure how to say what he needed to say, but had committed, in some internal and irreversible way, to saying it. "I know," she said. "I'll be there." She went to find the juice box. Marcus sat back down beside his son. And in the hallway outside, room 7, Diane Whitfield stood at the nurse's station with her phone in her hand and a smile that no longer quite fit her face, and she began making calls. Because she had read the room, too, and she understood that the story she had been managing was no longer going the way she had planned. And women like Diane, precise, controlled, practiced in the art of narrative, did not give up stories without a fight. The call Diane made from the hallway of St. Catherine's Hospital lasted 4 minutes. Camille did not hear it. Marcus did not know about it. But by the time Theo was discharged the following afternoon with a care plan, a follow-up appointment, and a small foam stress ball the nurses had given him as a parting gift, something had already been set in motion in the Hale household that was not going to stop on its own. Camille felt it the moment she walked back through the front door. The quality of the silence had changed. It was the particular silence of a house where someone has been through the rooms before you, touching things. Mary, the housekeeper who came in 3 days a week, met her in the hallway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. She looked at Camille, looked at Theo, holding Camille's hand, with his foam ball tucked under his other arm, and said quietly, "Ms. Whitfield was here this morning, while you were at the hospital." Camille kept her face still. "Okay," she said. "She was in Mr. Hale's study for a long time." Mary hesitated. "She had papers?" Camille nodded once. She walked Theo to the kitchen, made him toast with the precise amount of butter he required, sat with him while he ate it, and kept her hands very steady. She did not have to wait long to understand what the papers were. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sophie having been told her brother had a heart thing that was being fixed, and having responded to this information by drawing him a card featuring what appeared to be a heart-wearing sunglasses, Marcus came to find her. He was in the kitchen doorway the way he had been in the doorway of room 7, slightly uncertain of his welcome, reading the room before entering it. She was at the counter, sure she had her hands around a cup of tea she had made, and not drunk. "Diane wants me to let you go," Marcus said. He said it plainly, without cushioning, and she respected him for that. Camille did not look surprised. I thought she might. Her argument is that you misrepresented yourself when you were placed here, that you withheld professional credentials, that there's a liability issue. He paused. She found a legal brief. She had someone put it together. Camille set her cup down. That was fast. Diane is fast when she wants something. He said it without affection. He came into the kitchen properly then, not leaning in the doorway, but crossing to the island, standing across from her with the counter between them and his hands flat on the marble. She also suggested that your closeness with the children is inappropriate, that it's blurred professional lines. The word landed the way Diane had intended it to land, like something sharp disguised as something reasonable. Camille absorbed it the way she had absorbed all of Diane's careful language over 2 years. Then she looked at Marcus steadily. "Is that what you think?" she asked. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the garden was dark. The kitchen light was warm and direct between them. He shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not what I think." She nodded. She picked up her tea. "Then what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something first, and I need you to be honest with me." "I have been honest with you," she said simply. "It wasn't always well timed, but it was honest. Why did you stay?" He said it carefully, like a man who has prepared the question and is still not sure of it. "Not just for Theo. You could have found another job. You could have recertified, gone back to nursing. You have the background. You clearly have the skill." He looked at her. "Why did you stay in a house where nobody saw you? Where you were," he paused on the word, "invisible?" Camille was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "Because being invisible was the cost," she said. "And the thing on the other side of the cost was worth it." She paused. "Sophie was having nightmares every other night when I came here. She wouldn't eat at the table without Elena's chair being moved. She used to stand in the hallway outside your study in the evenings and not knock, just stand there, and then go back to her room." A beat. And Theo. I already told you about Theo." Marcus said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I didn't stay because nobody else would have me," Camille continued. "I stayed because leaving would have meant leaving them, and I couldn't do that." She said it without drama, without self-congratulation, as a simple, declarative fact. That's all. Marcus stood at his own kitchen counter, in his own house, with his children asleep upstairs, and this woman's honest face in front of him, and he felt the full, uncomfortable size of the debt. Not a financial debt. Something that could not be repaid with a number, which made it more uncomfortable, not less, for a man who had spent most of his adult life solving problems by finding the right number. He picked up his phone. He typed a message and sent it before he looked up. "I've asked Diane not to come to the house," he said. Camille looked at him. "Marcus, not permanently. But while I'm sorting through what these last 2 years have actually looked like." He set the phone face down. "I owe you that, at minimum. A house where people aren't working against you while you're at the hospital with my son." She didn't argue. She didn't thank him effusively. She just said, "Okay." And he understood that this was who she was. That grace, with her, was not a performance, but a default. Something so deeply lived that she didn't even recognize it as exceptional anymore. He left the kitchen. She stood for a while longer, listening to the house settle around her, and then she poured her cold tea down the drain and went to check on the children. Sophie was starfished across her mattress, one arm dangling off the edge. The sleep of someone with a completely clear conscience. Theo was curled on his side, the foam stress ball tucked under his chin like a small second pillow. His breathing was even. Camille stood in his doorway and counted it, not out of fear tonight, but out of habit, out of love, out of the deep cellular relief of knowing that what she had been watching for had been caught in time. She turned his nightlight on and went to bed. The conversation with Diane came 3 days later. Camille was not present for it. She did not ask to be. She learned the shape of it afterward, not because Marcus told her in detail, but because Diane's white BMW did not appear in the driveway again after that Thursday, and because Sophie, with the perfect peripheral perception of a 7-year-old, I reported over breakfast that Daddy had been on the phone in his study for a long time last night, and his voice had been very serious. What Marcus had learned in the days between the hospital and that Thursday was this. Diane had been reshaping the household narrative for over a year. Small things consistently applied. The suggestion, repeated in different forms across different conversations, that the children's attachment to Camille was becoming unhealthy, that Camille's involvement in their routines was exceeding what was appropriate for her role, that Marcus's reliance on her for household management was, perhaps, something he should examine, each suggestion individually reasonable. Together, assembled in sequence, a careful architecture designed to reduce Camille's standing, her access, and her belonging in this house, so that when Diane eventually stepped into that space permanently, there would be no one already standing there. Marcus had understood this on some level for longer than he admitted to himself. He had simply been too tired and too absent and too willing to defer to someone who seemed to have things organized. It was easier to accept the framing than to question it. It was easier to step over the bucket. He had stopped finding it easy. The brief Diane had prepared, the liability argument, the professional misrepresentation, he had taken to his own legal team. Their assessment, without merit. Camille had been placed as a housekeeper. She had performed as a housekeeper. That she possessed additional qualifications she had not disclosed was neither fraudulent nor actionable, and the care she had provided for Theo, far from creating liability, had almost certainly prevented a more serious cardiac event. His lawyer had used the word meticulous about the notebook, had said, with the restrained admiration of someone trained to suppress admiration, whoever kept this record knew exactly what they were doing. On the Friday after the hospital, Marcus came home at 3 in the afternoon, not because of an emergency, not because his schedule had collapsed. He simply closed his laptop, told his assistant to hold his calls, and drove home. He came through the front door to find Camille and Sophie at the kitchen table, working on a school project about weather systems, the table covered in construction paper and cotton balls. Theo was on the couch with his stress ball and a picture book on the careful horizontal position that was now part of his after-school routine. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway again. He seemed to be doing a lot of standing in doorways lately, as if he was relearning how to enter rooms that had been running without him. Sophie looked up and said, "Daddy, you're early," with the mild surprise of someone who has been told the library closes at 6 and arrived to find it open at 4. "I know," he said. "We're making a cloud," Sophie told him. "Can I help?" Sophie considered this with genuine deliberateness. "Do you know how to use a glue gun?" "No," Marcus admitted. "Cammy will teach you," Sophie said, and turned back to her cotton balls. Camille looked up at him. There was something in her face, not triumph, nothing as sharp as that. Something quieter, something that looked like the beginning of a door opening, if you knew how to read it. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you a glue gun." He sat down at his own kitchen table in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, and he made a cloud out of cotton balls and construction paper, while his daughter directed him with the authority of a small film producer, and his son called from the couch to report that the stress ball was actually really good. And Camille moved around the kitchen, unhurried, making after-school snacks, and the house smelled like warm bread and craft glue, and nothing about it was exceptional, except that Marcus Hale was present in it, actually present, and the difference that made was louder than anything he could have said. A week later, he called her into the study. He had prepared for the conversation, which she could tell by the way he sat, not behind his desk, but in the chair beside it, the informal side, the side that said he wasn't managing her. He had been in contact with the nursing board, the paperwork for her recertification, which had stalled because of the application fees and the scheduling requirements and the particular bureaucratic inertia that tends to pile up on people who are too tired and too busy surviving to push through it. That paperwork was moving. He had asked his assistant to help with the scheduling. The fees were handled. She would need to complete the clinical refresher program, 4 weeks, which meant time away from the household, and he had arranged for a temporary nanny to cover those weeks. The referral he had already sent to doctor. The park's practice would open a part-time pediatric care coordination role when she was fully certified, a role that would work around the children's schedule if she wanted it, if she wanted to be here, if she still wanted to be here. He said this last part carefully, like a man who understands that he does not have the right to assume. Camille looked at the folder he had put in front of her. She looked at the paperwork, her name on it, her credentials, the kind of bureaucratic machinery that had seemed immovable now, apparently in motion. She was quiet for a long time. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not the point." She looked up at him, and for the first time in 2 years, in this house, she let herself be fully seen. Not the Maid version of seen, not the staff version, not the useful fixture version. Seen as what she actually was, a woman who had given 2 years of careful, intelligent, loving attention to people who were not hers, at a cost to herself she had never tallied aloud, because the alternative was unthinkable. "Thank you," she said, quietly, without performance. "Thank you," he said back. There was a sound from upstairs, the particular thunder of Sophie's feet crossing her bedroom at speed, followed by Theo's voice saying her name in the long-suffering tone of a younger sibling who has learned that older sisters have no respect for peace. Camille smiled. Marcus smiled, and the sound of it, the completely ordinary, unearned, miraculous sound of 2 children alive and noisy and safe upstairs, filled the room between them like something they had both, separately, been waiting a long time to hear. Till Sophie came down to show them a drawing. She had made a portrait of the family, in the inexact but earnest style of a 7-year-old who has strong opinions about proportion. There was a tall figure she identified as Daddy. There was a smaller figure she identified as Theo. There was a figure with a construction paper cloud attached to it, which was apparently herself. And there, standing solidly in the center of the paper, drawn in careful detail, with a blue shirt and a ponytail, and a smile that took up half her face, was Camille. Not to the side, not in the background, not at the edge, in the center. The place that children assign, without instruction and without argument, to the person they consider the heart of a thing. Sophie held it up for their inspection, entirely confident in its accuracy. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Camille. She was looking at the drawing. Her throat moved. She pressed her lips together once, briefly, and then the smile came. The real one, not the careful one she kept for difficult rooms, but the unguarded one, the one that changed her whole face. "It's perfect," she told Sophie. And Sophie, satisfied, took her artwork and went back upstairs, trailing significance she did not know she carried. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be seen, and some people spend their whole lives seeing others, quietly, steadily, without applause, believing that love is not something you wait to be paid for. It is something you do because the person in front of you needs it, and you have it to give. Camille Torres mopped floors and made lunches and sat on the edges of beds in the dark. Oh, and she did it with the full force of everything she was. She did it when nobody was watching. She did it when nobody said thank you. She did it until the day, which always comes if you hold on long enough, when the truth stopped being invisible. What Marcus Hale found at St. Catherine's Hospital was not a maid. He found the person who had been holding his family together, one quiet day at a time, in all the spaces he had forgotten to fill. And what he chose to do with that finding, the actual, concrete, irreversible choice he made, said more about who he was becoming than anything he had ever signed his name to. That is the kind of wealth that does not appear on any spreadsheet. It is the only kind that, at the end of everything, turns out to have been worth anything at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.